300 yards. That is all the distance separating one American submarine from the largest warship Japan had ever built. It is 3:17 in the morning, November 29, 1944, and Commander Joseph Enright is staring through a periscope at a ship longer than 3 football fields laid end to end. His hand is steady on the firing switch. His crew is silent behind him. But 11 months earlier, this same man had let Japan's most decorated aircraft carrier slip past him untouched, then walked into his admiral's office and asked to be relieved of command. He spent half a year behind a desk while other captains hunted and killed. Nobody expected him back at sea. Nobody expected this. Now 6 torpedoes sit loaded in his tubes, and somewhere above him, 81 men are holding their breath. What Enright does not know is that the ship in his crosshairs was never supposed to exist, a secret so closely guarded that American intelligence had no name for it, no class, no idea of its true size. In the next 6 hours, 1 failed officer and 1 hidden monster of steel are about to collide, and only one of them will still be afloat by sunrise. The periscope handles were cold under Joseph Enright's palms. 300 yards away, a shadow longer than 3 football fields was turning slowly across the black water, its silhouette blotting out the stars. Enright did not blink. He had waited 11 months for a moment like this one, and he was not about to lose it to fatigue or fear. Somewhere behind him, 80 men stood in the red glow of the control room, listening to their captain breathe. None of them knew yet what they were about to become part of. None of them knew this ship should not have existed at all. To understand how Joseph Enright ended up here, in the darkness south of Tokyo Bay, with his finger over a firing switch, you have to go back to a morning 14 months earlier, to a different submarine, and to the worst day of his career. Enright was 34 years old in November of 1944, a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1933, a man who had spent 3 years on the battleship Maryland before qualifying for submarines in 1936. By the time the war reached the Pacific, he had 8 years of experience beneath the waves. On paper, he looked exactly like the kind of officer the submarine force wanted commanding its newest boats. In July of 1943, the Navy gave him USS Dace, fresh off the builder's yard at Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. It was the assignment every submarine officer dreamed about. A new hull, an experienced crew, and orders sending him straight into the richest hunting grounds in the Pacific, the approaches to Japan itself. Dace crossed the Panama Canal, reached Pearl Harbor in October, and received her patrol orders 2 weeks later. Southeast coast of Honshu. Heavy merchant traffic reported in the area. Everything about the assignment promised results. The first weeks went well enough. On November 7th, Enright found an unescorted freighter and put 3 torpedoes into her. She did not sink. Japanese patrol boats arrived before he could finish the job, and Dace was forced deep to survive the depth charges that followed. When Enright surfaced that night to search for his kill, all he found was an oil slick and drifting wreckage. No ship. The freighter had limped home and been repaired. Damaged, not sunk, not a credit to his record. Then, on November 15th, came the message that would define the rest of his career, one way or another. Ultra-intelligence, the code-breaking program feeding advance warning of Japanese ship movements to American submarines, reported that the aircraft carrier Shokaku had left Yokosuka, steaming south. Shokaku was no ordinary target. She had launched planes at Pearl Harbor. She had fought in nearly every major carrier battle of the war. Sinking her would have made any submarine captain's career. Enright calculated her course, positioned Dace along the most likely track, and waited at periscope depth. When the carrier finally appeared on the horizon, he moved to intercept exactly as doctrine demanded. Get ahead of the target. Submerge. Let her come to you. But Shokaku zigzagged at the wrong moment, cutting 30 degrees away from Dace's position, and suddenly Enright was too far out to fire with any real chance of a hit. He had a choice in that instant that would haunt him. Surface, run hard, and try to reposition before dawn, exposed him to her escorts, or stay hidden and fire long-range torpedoes into the dark with almost no chance of success. Enright chose to surface and chase. For nearly an hour he pushed Dace at flank speed through the pre-dawn water, but the light was coming up fast, and a submarine caught on the surface near a carrier task force does not survive the encounter. At 0940 hours, with the sun rising and Shokaku's destroyer screen close enough to spot him, Enright made the only call he believed he could make. He ordered Dace to dive. The attack was over before it began. Shokaku steamed on, never knowing how close she had come to the bottom of the ocean. Enright surfaced again after dark, searched the empty horizon, and radioed headquarters the truth. Contact made. Attack aborted, no damage inflicted. The silence that came back from Pearl Harbor felt heavier than any reprimand could have. The rest of that patrol brought nothing to redeem it. A tanker escaped under fire from Japanese escorts on November 23rd. By the time Dace limped back to Midway on December 11th, 49 days at sea had produced exactly 0 confirmed sinkings and 1 missed opportunity against the most valuable carrier in the Pacific theater. Enright knew what his commanding admiral, Charles Lockwood, would think when he read that report. Lockwood was known for giving his captains wide latitude to make their own tactical calls, and he was equally known for pulling men out of command when results did not follow. Enright did not wait to find out which way the decision would go. On December 12th, he wrote his own request. He asked to be relieved, admitting plainly that the patrol had been unproductive and that another officer might perform better in his place. Lockwood granted it within 2 days. Dace received a new captain and went on, under different hands, to sink ship after ship and earn a presidential citation. The boat had never been the problem. Enright had been the problem, or so it seemed to every man at the Midway submarine base watching him walk to a desk job instead of a control room. For 6 months, Enright processed patrol reports and coordinated repair schedules while other captains went out and came home with kill flags painted on their conning towers. Officers who failed in command rarely got a second chance. There were more qualified men than available submarines, and the Navy did not waste boats on captains who had already proven they could hesitate at the wrong moment. But Enright refused to let that be the end of his story. In June of 1944, he requested 15 minutes of Lockwood's time and used it to argue that his failure on Dace had not come from a lack of skill, but from an excess of caution, from trusting doctrine over his own instincts. He had learned the lesson. He wanted one more chance to prove it. Lockwood listened, reviewed his record, upper third of his class at Annapolis, years of solid service, 0 major errors outside the Shokaku incident, and made a decision that would change naval history, though neither man could have known it yet. Enright would get his second command, just not immediately. He waited through the summer at Midway. Then, in late August, Lockwood finally called him in. USS Archerfish needed a new captain, he said. Her 4th patrol had just ended without a single kill, and her crew was experienced but frustrated. Lockwood needed a man willing to be aggressive when the moment demanded it. He asked Enright directly if he could be that man. Enright said yes without hesitation. On September 1st, 1944, he took command of USS Archerfish. While Enright was rebuilding his career from behind a desk, half a world away in the Yokosuka Naval Yard, an entirely different kind of secret was taking shape, one that had nothing to do with redemption and everything to do with desperation. After the catastrophe at Midway in June of 1942, where Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day, the Imperial Navy faced a shortage it could not solve through normal means. Building a new carrier from the keel up took 3 years, and Japan did not have 3 years. Sitting half-finished in dry dock at Yokosuka was the 3rd hull of the Yamato class, sister to the most powerful battleships ever built, 18-inch guns, 72,000 tons, armor that could shrug off almost any naval gun afloat. Someone in the Naval Architecture Office proposed an audacious solution. Strip away the battleship superstructure being built on that hull and replace it with a flight deck. turn a battleship into a carrier, keep the armor belt, keep the survivability, and deliver a warship unlike anything the world had seen. The work continued in near-total secrecy for 2 years, hidden under camouflage netting even as American reconnaissance flights photographed the yard again and again. Nobody in naval intelligence knew what was taking shape underneath that netting. They only knew it was large. Her name was Shinano, after the longest river in Japan, a name reserved for the empire's most important warships. She was commissioned on November 19, 1944, under Captain Toshio Abe, and the ceremony was brief because the ship was nowhere near ready. Watertight doors were missing. Pumps meant for critical compartments had never arrived. Most of her crew had never served aboard a carrier in their lives. Abe asked for 2 more months to finish fitting her out and train his men properly. He was refused. American bombers were striking Tokyo with growing frequency, and Shinano was too valuable and too vulnerable to leave sitting still. She was ordered to Kure, 300 miles away, where she could finish preparation under better protection. Abe wanted better weather and a larger escort before he sailed. He got neither. 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, were assigned to guard the largest warship in the world, when 6 would barely have been enough. Abe protested. He was overruled. On November 28, 1944, at 13:30 hours, Shinano departed Yokosuka, carrying 50 kamikaze rocket bombs in her cargo holds and not a single operational aircraft in her hangar bays. She was not yet a warship. She was a ferry carrying a secret through waters that American submarines were known to patrol. That same night, 60 miles south of Tokyo Bay, Joseph Enright's lifeguard assignment, rescuing downed bomber crews, was canceled when the day's air raids were called off. For the first time in weeks, Enright was free to hunt. At 20:48 hours, his radar operator called out a contact. 2 ships, 12 miles distant, bearing north. Large returns. Enright gave the order to close and intercept, with no idea yet that the shape moving through the darkness ahead of him was the ship the entire Imperial Navy had spent 2 years hiding from the world. At 2200 hours, the lookouts on Archerfish's bridge finally got their first visual confirmation. One massive vessel, running with 3 destroyers in tight formation around her, all 4 ships cutting sharp, irregular turns through the dark water. The escorts moved like they were guarding something precious. Enright raised his binoculars and studied the silhouette of the larger ship. Too much superstructure for a tanker. Too much height. Whatever this was, it was a warship, and a big one. His executive officer put her length at over 800 feet. Neither man had a name for what they were looking at. Neither man had ever seen anything like it in a recognition manual. The destroyers made the approach brutally complicated. They ran anti-submarine patterns around the larger ship, forcing the whole formation into irregular turns that made prediction nearly impossible. Enright held his position at 12,000 yards and started doing what submarine captains do best in moments like this. He watched. He measured speed. He counted seconds between course changes. The Japanese formation was making 20 knots, and Archerfish could just barely match that on the surface, which meant a straight chase was a losing proposition. Enright would have to read their rhythm and cut the angle before they ever noticed him. Aboard the carrier herself, Captain Toshio Abe had his own radar contact to worry about. At 20:48 hours, the same moment Archerfish's operator first called out the signal, Shinano's own equipment detected a surface contact 12 miles to the south. Abe assumed immediately that it was an American submarine, and he ordered a course change to try to shake it off, swinging the formation southwest. The contact matched his turn almost perfectly, holding distance rather than closing, which told Abe something he did not want to believe. Whatever was out there was tracking him, and it was likely radioing his position to other submarines in the area. Abe had read enough intelligence briefings to know that American wolf packs, groups of submarines coordinating an attack together, had become common in these waters. 3 confirmed submarine contacts had been logged near his route in the past week alone. He assumed he was facing more than one boat, and doctrine told him the answer was speed. Outrun them before they could organize a coordinated strike, clear the area, and reach Cure before daylight gave them another chance. He ordered flank speed, but the order came back countermanded within minutes. The starboard outboard propeller shaft bearing was running hot, dangerously close to failure, and his engineering officer warned that pushing the shaft any harder risked losing it entirely hundreds of miles from a repair yard. Abe had no real choice. At 23:22 hours, Shinano's speed dropped to 18 knots, the exact speed Archerfish could sustain on the surface. Without knowing it, Abe had just handed Enright the one advantage he needed. The gap that should have widened all night instead began, slowly and steadily, to close. His officers offered him options, and he turned down every one. His executive officer suggested launching aircraft to search the darkness for submarines, but Shinano's hangar bays held no operational planes, only cargo and rocket bombs bound for Kyushu. His operations officer proposed switching on searchlights to force any submarine on the surface to dive for cover. Abe refused outright, certain that lights would only broadcast his position to every submarine within 20 miles, rather than just the one he already suspected was there. The same officer suggested radioing for land-based air cover. Abe refused that too, unwilling to risk a transmission that American codebreakers might intercept and use to pinpoint him more precisely than his enemy already had. He was trying to slip through by stealth and speed alone, never suspecting that the stealth had already failed and the speed had just been taken away from him by his own machinery. Below decks, the ship that carried his flag was still, in every sense that mattered, unfinished. Watertight doors meant to seal her into survivable compartments sat only partially installed. Pumps that should have been fighting flooding in a dozen places had never arrived from the mainland before she sailed. Most of the roughly 2,200 men aboard had never served on a carrier before this voyage, let alone one still being built around them as they crossed dangerous water. Abe had asked for 2 more months in port to finish the work and train his crew properly. He had been given 9 days. Every officer who had walked her passageways in the weeks before departure understood exactly how much remained unfinished, and every one of them had said so, and every one of them had been overruled by a high command that needed her at sea more than it needed her ready. The real chase began at 21:30 hours, when Enright ordered all 4 diesel engines pushed to their absolute limit, rated for 1,600 horsepower each in sustained operation. The engines would need to run at 1,800 to keep pace, a demand that risked real damage. The chief engineer warned him plainly that this kind of strain could crack a bearing or blow a seal hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port. Enright accepted the risk without hesitation. Losing this target was not a possibility he was willing to entertain. Below decks, the engine room crew watched their gauges climb toward the red, monitoring temperature and fuel burn by lamplight, while the diesels roared and black smoke poured from the exhaust ports into a night too dark for Japanese lookouts to see it. The sound, though, carried for miles across open water, and Enright kept at least 8,000 yards of distance behind the Japanese formation, close enough to track, far enough that engine noise alone would not give him away. Every 12 minutes, without fail, the enemy formation turned 30 degrees, first left, then right, a zigzag pattern designed to frustrate exactly the kind of pursuit Enright was attempting. He timed it obsessively, checking his watch against every turn, building a mental map of where the ships would be minutes and hours from now. If the pattern held, the Japanese would cross within 5,000 yards of Archerfish's position by roughly 02:30, close enough for a submerged ambush. Everything depended on that pattern holding. By 22:30, the gap between the two forces had narrowed only slightly. Archerfish was making 20 3/10 knots against the enemy's 20, a paper-thin advantage that would take hours to translate into real distance. Half an hour later, the Japanese ships turned northwest, cutting the range down to 7,000 yards, close enough now that Archerfish's sonar operator began picking up the steady beat of their propellers through the water. Enright passed the word through the boat. No unnecessary movement, no loud talk. Sound traveled through water far better than it ever did through air, and one careless noise could end the pursuit before it truly began. At 23:30, the pattern shifted slightly. The turns still came every 12 minutes, but the angle had tightened to 25 degrees, which meant the formation was covering more ground on each leg. Enright adjusted his intercept course to compensate, but the adjustment cost him time. By midnight he had closed to 6,000 yards, still gaining, but slowly, and the chief engineer was now reporting that the engines had crept dangerously close to their maximum safe temperature. Enright made the call to ease back to 1,700 horsepower, letting the engines breathe even as Archerfish's speed dropped to 19.5 knots. The gap opened again. 7,000 yards. 8,000. He was losing ground with every minute that passed, and he knew it. At midnight, he pushed the engines back to full power and watched Archerfish claw her way back to 20 3/10 knots. The gap steadied, then began closing once more. 7,500 yards. 7,000. Then, at 0100 hours, the Japanese formation turned again, this time directly away from him, southwest, putting Archerfish in the worst possible position, chasing dead astern, with no way to close the angle, no matter how hard the engines worked. A pursuit from directly behind could go on forever without ever ending in a shot. Enright weighed his options in the dark. He could break off and hunt for an easier target elsewhere. He could call for support from other submarines patrolling nearby. Or he could hold the course, trust the pattern, and wait for one more turn to hand him the geometry he needed. He chose to hold. If this was a carrier, and every instinct told him it was, then nothing else in these waters was worth more than staying on her tail. His fuel state was becoming a real concern by this point. Running at flank speed burned diesel at nearly 3 times the normal rate, and Archerfish had perhaps 6 hours of fuel left at this pace before she would need to slow down simply to make it back to friendly waters. Enright checked his watch. It was 01:35. By 07:30, the chase would have to end, one way or another. At 0200, the formation zigzagged back to the northwest, restoring the geometry Enright had been waiting for. He was now 7,000 yards behind and slightly to port, and if the pattern held for another half hour, he would find himself ahead of their base course rather than trailing it. By 0230, the numbers finally broke his way. He was 6,000 yards back but positioned ahead of their track, and if the Japanese turned southwest one more time, they would pass within striking range. He gathered his officers in the cramped confines of the control room and laid out the plan in the fewest words possible. When they turn southwest, we submerge. We get across their track and let them come to us. We fire everything in the bow tubes in one spread, because a target this size does not get a second chance from us. Then we go deep and we evade. His officers understood without needing it repeated. This was the moment 2 months of preparation under his command had been building toward. At 0256, the Japanese formation turned southwest exactly as Enright had gambled it would. The geometry was perfect. He gave the order to dive, and Archerfish slipped beneath the black surface without a ripple, ballast tanks flooding smoothly as she settled to periscope depth, 60 feet down. Enright raised the scope for a look, 7,000 yards out and closing at 20 knots, roughly 17 minutes to contact. He lowered it again almost immediately. A periscope left up too long left awake, and awake could be spotted by a sharp-eyed lookout even in darkness. The crew rigged the boat for silent running. Ventilation fans shut down. Anything that hummed or rattled was isolated and secured. 81 men stood at their stations in a quiet, broken only by the low murmur of electric motors and the sound of their own breathing. The air inside the hull had already gone thick and warm, heavy with the smell of diesel oil and sweat from 6 hours of hard running on the surface. Nobody complained. Nobody moved more than duty required. Young sailors who had never fired a shot in anger stood beside veterans of earlier patrols, all of them watching the same silent captain for some sign of what was coming. In the forward torpedo room, The crews assigned to tubes 1 through 6 ran their hands over the firing mechanisms one final time, checking and rechecking settings that had already been checked twice. There was nothing left to do but wait, and waiting, every submariner aboard understood, was its own kind of test. At 0300, Enright raised the scope again for a quick look. 5,000 yards now, and the target's shape had resolved into something unmistakable. A flight deck. A tall island superstructure rising off the starboard side. This was a carrier, larger than any he had ever studied in a recognition manual. Larger than anything he believed the Japanese Navy possessed. He sketched what he could see as fast as his hand would move. Length, beam, the layout of her superstructure. Details that intelligence analysts would need after the patrol, assuming there was an after. He lowered the scope and kept tracking by feel, by the numbers he had already committed to memory. The formation had turned southwest at 2230, back northwest at 2300, and he had adjusted each time without needing to expose the scope more than a few seconds at a stretch. This was not luck. This was 3 hours of pure mathematics, speed, bearing, the 12-minute rhythm of a zigzag that had become as familiar to him as his own pulse. At 0304, a problem emerged. The carrier was going to pass north of his position, the wrong angle for a clean shot. He needed her to expose her broadside, not her bow or stern, and a shot at the wrong angle against a target this size would waste everything he had built toward. He did not believe in luck. He believed in geometry, and he waited for the numbers to turn in his favor. At 0312, they did. The carrier turned south, another 30-degree course change in her endless zigzag, and this one put her on a collision course with Archerfish's position. Enright ordered the final approach. The submarine crept forward at barely 2 knots, the range falling steadily, 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,200. The destroyer screen was spread only 300 yards ahead of the carrier herself, and if Archerfish crept any closer, their sonar would find her. At 1,400 yards, Enright knew he had run out of room. He had to fire now or lose the shot entirely. He set his firing solution with the discipline of a man who had spent 11 months rehearsing this exact moment in his head. All 6 forward tubes ready. Torpedo depth set to run shallow, just 10 feet below the surface, in direct defiance of standard doctrine, which called for 15 to 20 feet to strike beneath the waterline. Enright had his own reasoning. A ship this size would almost certainly carry anti-torpedo bulges below the waterline, thick armored compartments built to absorb exactly the kind of hit doctrine assumed he would deliver. He wanted his torpedoes higher, above the bulges, where the plating would be thinner and the damage would cut deeper. If they ran a little deep, they would still strike below the waterline anyway. Either way, the target would flood. Fire 1, 8 seconds. Fire 2, 8 seconds. Fire 3. Fire 4, 5, 6. 6 torpedoes running hot, straight and true through the black water. Enright kept his eye pressed hard against the periscope, watching the first wake close the distance. 45 seconds ticking by in what felt like far longer. The first torpedo struck the carrier's starboard side amidships at 03:117 hours. A fireball tore open the night, and a heavy booming crack rolled back through the water and into the hull of Archerfish herself, a sound the whole crew felt as much as heard. 8 seconds later, the second torpedo hit, another fireball lighting the horizon. For one instant, nobody in the control room breathed, as though the sound itself needed silence to travel the last few feet into their chests. Then the crew erupted in cheers they could barely contain, men who had spent 6 hours in near total quiet, finally letting go of everything they had been holding in. But Enright kept his eye fixed to the scope, unwilling to celebrate a kill he had not yet confirmed with his own eyes. A third hit struck near the stern. A fourth landed forward of amidships. 4 confirmed hits. The last 2 torpedoes ran under the hull or missed wide into the dark, and there was no time left to confirm anything further, because the destroyer escort was already turning hard toward Archerfish's position, and depth charges were coming. Enright gave the order to dive to 400 feet, a depth that pushed dangerously close to what a Below-class submarine's hull was built to survive. Archerfish's rated test depth was 312 feet, with 400 as an absolute operational ceiling, beyond which the pressure hull risked catastrophic failure. Enright was betting everything that the Japanese depth charges were set to detonate shallower than that, and he had no way to know for certain if he was right. The boat dropped fast, venting ballast, flooding tanks, sinking through the dark water, while the crew rigged for silent running once more. No talking. No unnecessary movement. Only the essential systems left running, and every man aboard listening in the dark for what would come next. The hull groaned softly under the growing pressure, as Archerfish passed depths she had rarely been asked to reach, a low creaking that every man aboard felt in his chest before he consciously registered the sound. Nobody spoke. Sailors gripped whatever was nearest, a pipe, a valve wheel, the edge of a bunk, and stared upward as though they could see through steel to whatever was gathering on the surface above them. The first depth charge exploded at 0326 hours, distant, at least 500 yards off, a dull, muffled thud that rolled through the water and rattled loose gear against the deck plates, a sign that the destroyers were guessing rather than tracking. 13 more followed over the next 12 minutes, each one closer than the last felt in the ears of frightened men, even when the instruments said otherwise. None of them close enough to threaten the hull. The Japanese were dropping their pattern where the torpedo wakes had originated, not where Archerfish actually was, 400 yards south and 400 feet down. The geometry that had carried Enright through the entire night carried him through this moment as well. By 0347, the attack stopped. The destroyers had lost contact entirely. Enright held Archerfish at 400 feet for another hour, listening through the hydrophones to the sounds carrying down from the surface. He could hear the carrier's engines fall silent. Then came something else entirely, a deep, grinding, metallic groan that went on, bulkheads failing somewhere far above, compartments giving way one after another. The sound continued for 47 minutes, timed precisely by his sonar operator, a slow procession of groans and cracks and muffled booms that made grown men in the control room exchange glances without a word, imagining things none of them said aloud. Then, finally, silence. A silence so complete after nearly an hour of grinding metal that it felt, to more than one man aboard Archerfish, almost louder than the noise it replaced. Enright assumed the carrier had gone down. He logged the time as 0434 hours. He was wrong, though he had no way of knowing it yet. A submarine sitting 400 feet below the surface cannot see what remains afloat above it. All Enright had was sound, and the sound told him the story was over. At 0500 hours, he brought Archerfish cautiously back up to periscope depth, uncertain whether the destroyers were still hunting. He raised the scope for 3 seconds, swept the horizon in a full circle, and found nothing. No destroyers, no carrier, no wreckage. Empty ocean in every direction. He lowered the scope, took Archerfish back down to 200 feet, and set a course south, away from the waters he had just fought through. Behind him, his crew allowed themselves, for the first time since the chase began 9 hours earlier, something close to rest. Men who had stood rigid at silent running now sat slumped against bulkheads, exhausted in the particular way that comes only after hours spent bracing for a death that never arrived. Enright said little. There would be time later for congratulations. For now there was only the low hum of the motors, the dark water outside the hull, and the long run home. What Enright did not know, what he could not have known, was that the ship he had just attacked was still afloat at that very moment, still steaming south at 18 knots with 4 torpedo holes tearing her open from the inside, still carrying more than 2,000 men who had no idea yet whether they would live to see the sun rise. Captain Abe made his damage assessment at 0330 hours, and the numbers were already bad. 4 compartments flooded, 3 boiler rooms lost, taking half the ship's power generation with them. Water pouring through gaps in watertight doors that had never been finished before the ship sailed. The carrier was listing 7 degrees to starboard, and every minute that passed added weight to that number. Abe had 3 real choices in front of him. Order counterflooding to correct the list. Slow down and pour every resource into damage control. Or run for the nearest coast, 60 miles distant, and try to beach her before she went under entirely. He chose none of them. Instead, he ordered his crew to hold maximum speed toward the nearest naval base, believing that speed would outrun whatever submarines remained in the area and get his ship to safety before the flooding became unmanageable. It was the same instinct that had guided every decision he had made since the radar contact 8 hours earlier. Move fast. Stay ahead of the threat. It was the wrong choice, and it was the last real chance he had to save her. Holding speed drove more water through the gaps in her unfinished hull with every mile she covered. The list crept upward, 10 degrees by 0400, 14 degrees by 0500. His engineering officer reported to him at 0530 that the pumps were losing the fight and that Shinano would sink unless something changed immediately. Only then did Abe order counterflooding, and by then the angle had already grown too severe for it to do any real good. He agreed to cut speed to 12 knots, hoping the slower pace would buy his damage control teams enough time to shore up bulkheads and seal what leaks they could reach. The list stabilized there, at 14 degrees, for a short while. But the ship had been built with a flaw nobody could see from the outside. Investigators who studied her wreck after the war determined that the joint where the waterline armor belt met the underwater anti-torpedo bulge had never been engineered properly, and Enright's torpedoes had struck almost precisely along that seam. The force of the explosions had knocked an iron support beam loose inside one of the flooded boiler rooms, and that beam had punched straight through into the compartment next to it, opening a leak that no amount of shoring could seal from the inside. By 0700, the executive officer told Abe plainly that the ship was doomed, that the list was worsening no matter what the damage control teams tried. Abe refused to accept it. He ordered every man not needed at a critical station to gather on the port side of the flight deck, gambling that the combined weight of more than 1,000 bodies might counterbalance what the sea had already claimed. It did not work. By 0800, the list had reached 18 degrees, and water was pouring into spaces that had been bone dry only 2 hours before. Her speed had fallen to 6 knots. The 3 destroyers stayed close in formation, ready for what all of them now understood was coming, while Abe continued to insist, against every report reaching him, that his ship could still be saved. At 0900, the list passed 25 degrees. Men on the lower decks could no longer stand without holding onto something fixed. Loose equipment broke free and slid into the starboard bulkheads with a violence that injured sailors who had nowhere to retreat. Only then did Abe finally give the order every man aboard had been waiting for. Non-essential personnel would abandon ship. 1,200 sailors and civilian workers moved up to the flight deck while the destroyers closed alongside, rigging rope ladders down their hulls so men could climb across from a ship that was rolling further onto her side with every passing minute. The transfer took 90 minutes, slow and dangerous work in the dark. The sailors still trapped below decks in those final hours faced a different kind of horror than the men topside. In compartments cut off by flooding and jammed watertight doors, some men fought in darkness against rising water with nothing but their bare hands and whatever tools they could find, while others simply waited, knowing there was no path out, listening to the ship groan and shift around them as she rolled further onto her side. Officers who had trained for years to fight surface engagements and aerial attacks found themselves instead fighting a slow, mathematical death, a battle against gravity and seawater that no gun or plane could win for them. By 10:30, the list had reached 40 degrees. Shinano was no longer steaming so much as rolling, and Abe gave the final order. Everyone remaining, roughly 800 men, jumped from the flight deck into the cold water below, and the destroyers moved in to pull as many as they could from the sea. At 10:57 hours, less than 8 hours after the first torpedo struck her, Shinano capsized and went under, taking her captain down with her, along with 1,435 men who never made it off the deck in time. 1,080 were pulled from the water alive. The largest warship ever built had sailed for exactly 9 days after her commissioning, had covered barely 170 miles from the yard that built her, and had never once launched an aircraft or fired a gun in anger. Joseph Enright knew almost none of this as Archerfish made her way south through the early morning. He surfaced around 0800 and transmitted his contact report to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Enemy carrier attacked at 0317. 4 torpedo hits observed. Target believed sunk. He estimated her size at 28,000 tons, the largest figure he could reasonably justify given what he had glimpsed through a periscope in the dark. He had nothing in any recognition manual to compare her against, because nothing like her had ever been catalogued. Naval intelligence reviewed his sketches with open skepticism. A ship as large as the one Enright described would surely have shown up on reconnaissance photographs by now, and none of Japan's known carrier classes matched what he had drawn. The analysts settled on a safer explanation: a merchant hull converted into a makeshift carrier, something in the 28,000-ton range. Enright's executive officer backed the account. His lookouts backed it. His sonar operator's 47 minutes of recorded breakup noises backed it. But without a photograph or a captured prisoner to confirm the kill, naval intelligence could not verify what had actually gone to the bottom that night, and Enright was credited only with a carrier of unknown type and uncertain size. He received the Navy Cross. Archerfish received a Presidential Unit citation, praising her for a 6.5-hour pursuit that ended when she penetrated a destroyer screen and struck with, in the citation's own words, all 6 of her torpedoes finding their mark. Only 4 had actually hit. The Navy never corrected the record. It was close enough for the paperwork, even if it was not the truth. Enright returned to sea for one more patrol in January of 1945, then was promoted and moved into staff duties. His years as a submarine captain finished for good. Archerfish herself survived the war, was decommissioned in 1946, recommissioned twice more for Cold War service, and finally, on October 19, 1968, was sunk deliberately off the coast of California by another American submarine, USS Snook, used as nothing more than a target for torpedo practice. The boat that had destroyed the largest warship in history ended her own life on the receiving end of the exact weapon that had made her famous. The truth about what Enright had actually sunk did not surface until 1949, when American occupation forces gained access to captured Imperial Japanese Navy records. Buried among them was a single entry that changed everything. Aircraft carrier Shinano, hull number 110, commissioned November 19, 1944, sunk November 29, 1944, at the exact coordinates Enright had radioed in his original report. Displacement, 72,000 long tons. Cause, torpedo attack by an American submarine. Every detail matched. Naval intelligence revised his combat record accordingly, changing the tonnage from 28,000 to 72,000 and giving the kill its true name for the first time. Joseph Enright, once relieved of his own command for letting a target slip away untouched, had sunk the largest warship any submarine has ever destroyed, a record that still stands more than 80 years later. He rarely spoke publicly about it in the years that followed, living quietly in Fairfax, Virginia, working in aviation navigation after his retirement from the Navy in 1963. Not until 1987 did he finally tell the full story himself, publishing a memoir titled Shinano, The Sinking of Japan's Secret Supership, built from his own patrol reports, interviews with surviving crewmen, and the captured Japanese records that had confirmed his kill nearly 40 years after the fact. In it, he described the moment the first torpedo struck with a simple, unguarded honesty. I saw a huge fireball erupt near the stern of the target. Then we heard the noise of the first hit carried to us through the water. "Got them," I yelled. Joseph Enright died on July 20, 2000, at 89 years old, and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, submarine veterans traveling from across the country to see him off. The officer who had once asked to be relieved of his own command, certain he had failed his country in the waters off Japan, had gone on to sink the largest warship the world had ever built, a ship so secret that even the men hunting her had no name to give her until years after she was gone. Somewhere off the coast of Cape Shiono, 4,000 meters down, Shinano still rests where she capsized, her hull inverted, her flight deck resting against the seabed. 1,435 men entombed inside a warship that was never given the chance to prove what she was built for. Japanese law now protects the site as a war grave, and no diver has ever been permitted to disturb what remains of her. 80 years on, the record Enright set in the dark that November morning has never been matched by another submarine, before or since.